Okay, let's get going. We are on DAF Nun Hey Amud Aleph, and the Gemara was discussing half brothers and half sisters. Nun Hey Amud Aleph. The Gemara was talking about half brothers and half sisters, and we had seen that there's an Isser of Achos Ishto, that a person's wife's sister, his wife's sister is usher to him. And we had seen a Mishnah that talks about a half-sister is also usher. So if my wife's half-sister, it doesn't matter whether it's her maternal half-sister or her paternal half-sister, she's going to be usher to the Baal. She's going to be usher to the husband. So the question is, Minolan, where do we know this from? The Gemara answer is, Yalif me achoso. You connect it to the prohibition of a sister. Ma achoso bein min ha'av bein min ha'em, avkan bein min ha'av bein min ha'em. Now we know that the Torah prohibits a sister explicitly, a half-sister, right? It says, Bas Aviv O Vasimo. It says that in the Pasuk. It doesn't matter whether she's the daughter of your father or the daughter of your mother. She's usher to you either way. So therefore you see, since the Torah explicitly ushers a half-sister, a maternal or a paternal sister, so too it stands to reason that the Torah ushers a maternal or paternal sister of your wife. So the Gemara asks, "V'leilaf midodaso, ma dodaso min ha'av v'lo min ha'em, afka min ha'av v'lo min ha'em." So the Gemara says, but look at it the other way. Maybe you should say that, we saw your uncle's wife, right? It has to be an uncle that's related to your father paternally and not maternally in order for his wife to be usher. We had derived that yesterday. So maybe we could connect a sister-in-law to an uncle's wife the same way. So the Gemara says, "Mistavra me'achoso havalela me'lav sheken krove atzmo mikrove atzmo." The Gemara says it makes more sense to analogize your sister-in-law to your sister than to your sister-in-law to your aunt, because your aunt is related to you to your father, and right, it goes up a generation, whereas your sister-in-law is related to you in the same way that your sister is related to you through yourself and not through a parent. So the Gemara says, but adarabba midodaso havalela melav shekain davar al yedei kiddushin midavar shayidei kiddushin. But I could argue the other way. It's more analogous a sister-in-law to an aunt, to my uncle's wife, because both women are not blood relatives, they're related to me through marriage, whereas a sister is my blood relative. So you can argue the opposite. So ela me'eshes achi alfinan, the shekain davar al yedei kiddushin ukrove atzmo. So the answer is, the Gemara says, you're right. We learn it out not from your sister, but we learn it out from your brother's wife. Just like your brother's wife is usher, and it makes no difference whether your brother is your maternal or paternal brother, so too, your wife's sister is usher to you, and it makes no difference whether her sister is maternal or paternal. So the Gemara now says, and therefore, you don't have a question there, because that also, your brother's wife is a relation not through blood but through marriage, and therefore it's perfectly analogous to the case of Achos Ishto, your wife's sister. So now the Gemara says, okay, very good, but ve'eshes ach gufa minolan. How do you know that your brother's wife is usher to you regardless of whether your brother is maternal or paternal? Where do you know that from? So the Gemara says, Detanya. We learn it, the Brisa goes through the whole detail. It says, Ervas eshes achicha lo segale. It says in the Torah in Parshas Acharei Mos, do not expose the nakedness of your brother's wife. So bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em. So this teaches me that it makes no difference whether it's your paternal brother or maternal brother, the Isser is extant. So Ata Omer bein min ha'av bein min ha'em oinu ela min ha'av lo min ha'em. Maybe I'll tell you no. Maybe it's only a paternal brother and not a maternal brother. V'dinhu chiev kan v'chiev ba'achoso ma'achoso bein min ha'av bein min ha'em av kan bein min ha'av bein min ha'em. So on the one hand, the Brisa says, well, we can compare your brother's wife to a case of your sister. Just like your sister is usher whether it's maternal or paternal, so too your brother's wife is usher regardless of whether your brother is maternal or paternal. Oh, klach l'derech zu, chiev kan v'chiev b'dodaso, ma dodaso min ha'av v'lo min ha'em, av kan min ha'av v'lo min ha'em. But maybe on the other hand, says the Brisa, maybe you're better off analogizing your brother's wife to your uncle's wife. Just like your uncle's wife is only usher if your uncle is related paternally to your father and not maternally, so too is your brother's wife only usher if your brother's related to you paternally and not maternally. So nira lami doime. The Brisa then concludes, let's see what it is more analogous to. Done in krove atzma mikrove atzma ve'al tochich dodasu shekrove ha'em. On the one hand, a brother's wife is more comparable to your sister because they're both related to you directly, not through a parent, whereas your uncle's wife is related to you through your parent. Oh, klach l'derech zu, dan in davar shal yidei kiddushim, davar shal yidei kiddushim, al tochiach achoso shisar haba me'elav. Or you could argue the opposite. Both an uncle's wife and your brother's wife are related to you through marriage, and therefore they're more comparable than a case of sister who's your blood relative. So therefore, since we don't know which way to go, we need an additional verbiage in the pasuk to indicate to us what the halacha is. Talmud lomar ervas achicha hi. Therefore, the Torah says, do not expose the nakedness of your brother. It is your brother's nakedness. Right? In other words, it says the word erva twice to teach me that it makes no difference whether it's my maternal brother or my paternal brother. That's why the word erva is repeated. So, bein min ha'av, bein min ha'em. So that's the conclusion of the Brisa. Now the Gemara challenges the Brisa and it says, Ve'ema idi ve'idi be'eshes ach min ha'av. No, says the Gemara, maybe both times the word erva is mentioned in the pasuk is not to include a maternal brother, but is to address two cases of a paternal brother's wife. Chada diyesh labanim b'chaye bala, v'chada de'en labanim b'chaye bala. One is to address a woman who has children from your brother while your brother is still alive, and the other one is to address a woman who does not have children while your brother is still alive. Meaning that if your brother divorces her, even though she doesn't have children, she's still usher to you because your brother is alive. So the Gemara says, Ein labanim b'chaye bala mid Rav Huna nafka. But that we learned already from a pasuk from Rav Huna, because the Torah also calls your brother's wife nida. Like Rashi points out, we learned that yesterday. It says, Eishes achiv nidahi. It says by your brother's wife that she's a nida. We use the term nida to teach me that just like a nida does not, her prohibition does not become alleviated, so too, your brother's wife, her prohibition never becomes alleviated just because he divorces her. So the Gemara says that you don't need the second erva for that. Ve'ema idi ve'idi be'eshes ach min ha'av, chada diyesh labanim b'chaye bala, v'chada diyesh labanim la'achar misas baila. But wait a minute, says the Gemara. Maybe you need the two times it says erva to prohibit your brother's wife in two instances. One, while your brother is still alive, even though and the other one is to prohibit her when your brother is after your brother's death, in the case where she has children, because you remember, by the case of achos ishto, by your wife's sister, she becomes permitted to you after your wife dies. How do you know that if your brother dies, that that's not also the case by his wife, by his widow? And therefore, maybe that's the reason the Torah writes the word erva twice. Yesh labanim lachar misas baila lo tzricha kra. Mida amar rachmana she'en labanim muteres hayesh labanim asura. So the Gemara says, no, you wouldn't need an additional verbiage for that. The very fact that the Torah provides a prescription of yibum in a case where a woman has no children and she's widowed from your brother, that tells you ergo that if she's widowed and she has children, then she's prohibited. So you don't need a pasuk for that. The dilma ein labanim asura la'alma v'shari liyavam, yesh labanim shari la'alma v'shari liyavam. Not necessarily so. Maybe what the Torah tells you when it's giving you the mitzvah of yibum is that when she's widowed without children, then she's only allowed to marry the yavam, only the brother. But when she is widowed with children, maybe the Torah means to tell me that there's no mitzvah of yibum, but she's permitted to you, and she's permitted to anyone else also. So inami, ein labanim mitzvah, yesh labanim rishus. Or maybe I'll tell you what it means is that when she's childless and widowed, then there's mamash a mitzvah to marry her. When she's widowed, however, with children, she's not prohibited. It's just that there's no mitzvah of yibum, but you're still allowed to marry her. Inami ein labanim in yesh labanim lo v'lav haba michlal asei asei. Or maybe I'll tell you another principle. Maybe even if you'll argue that from the law of yibum you can adduce that when she's widowed with children, she's prohibited, but maybe it's only a mitzvah's lo saseh. Maybe it's only like a prohibition. That because there's a mitzvah, and I can't do the mitzvah because she has children, then it's only a prohibition. But the fact that not that there's necessarily an isser of kares that accompanies it, and therefore, so therefore, how do you know that the word erva, the extra word erva, is coming to be inclusive of your maternal brother? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because kasav kra achrina ervas achiv gila. That really I have 3 times the Torah says the word erva in the context of Eishasach. One is to tell me that it's for my paternal brother, one for my maternal brother, and one to tell me that when my brother's wife is widowed with children, she's usher through an isser kares. Okay, ve'ema eishes ach min ha'em ke'eshes ach min ha'av. Ma eshes ach min ha'av la'achar misa bayla sharia, af eshes ach min ha'em la'achar misas bayla sharia. But maybe I'll argue like this, that just like a paternal brother, after the brother dies, she's permitted through Yibum. Maybe the same thing will be true with the maternal brother. Now we know that the mitzvah of Yibum is only with the paternal brother, not with the maternal brother. But maybe I'll argue that just like a paternal brother, there's a heter to marry her after the brother dies, so too with the maternal brother. So Amar Kra hi bahavyasa tehe. So the Gemara says that no. That's why the Torah says the word he. It says ervas achicha hi. She is the erva of your brother, meaning to say that she is perpetually prohibited. And if that's not talking about a paternal brother's wife, because there is a way that she'll be permitted through Yibum, it must be referring to a maternal brother's wife, that she is perpetually usher to you even after she is widowed. Now, that concludes our discussion of Eishes Ach, and it also concludes our discussion of Achos Ishto. Now that we know that Eishes Ach is prohibited both if it's my maternal brother or my paternal brother, I also know that my wife's sister is usher to me, even if it's only a maternal sister of my wife. But now the Gemara goes on to another question. Achoso dekasav bakares lamali. Okay, now, there are a number of individual arayos where the Torah says that the penalty is kares. And the question is, says the Gemara, why does it have to write it by each individual erva if there's a sweeping statement at the end of Perak Yud Ches in Parshas Acharemos that anyone who does any of these actions will get kares? So why then do you have to write kares by the specific individuals? So the Gemara goes through a number of these permutations, but in today's Gemara we only are going to be discussing achoso. So why does the Torah have to write specifically kares by achoso if I know that any one of these arayas you get kares for? Lichad Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shi'masan kulam behelam echas chayvel kol echas ve'echas. It's to teach me that if I do multiple isurim of erva, let's say I'm intimate with a sister, I'm intimate with a mother, I'm intimate with a daughter, in all of those situations, even though I did it without interruption and there was no warning in between, I have to bring a korban for each and every act. That's why it says kares by achosa, to tell me, and this is the general rule, one of the 13 hermeneutic principles of Rabbi Yishmael is that anything that is yotze min haklal, davar yotze min haklal lo lalamed al atzma yatsa, ela lalamed al haklal kulo yatsa. That if you have something that is explicated by one individual case of a general rule, so then it's coming to reflect upon the general rule, not just reflecting upon itself. And therefore, the reason why kares is written specifically by achos ishto is to tell me that you're liable for each and every act, for each and every erva. So the Gemara now says, "Ula Rabbi Yitzchak damar kol chayav ekrisos bechlal hayu v'lo meyatzis kares ba'achoso ladunu bekares v'lo b'malkus lechalek minolan." But that will only work out if you don't learn like Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak had a different reason as to why kares is mentioned explicitly by achos ishto. And he said it's written specifically by her to tell me a different halacha. And that is as follows. We know that the penalty is kares, but in order to be liable for kares, you have to get hasra in advance. You have to be warned by witnesses in advance. Let's say the witnesses give you the incorrect warning. Instead of telling you that if you do this you're going to get kares, they tell you, if you do this, you're going to get malchus. So how do I know that you don't get malchus for a chi of kares? I know it from the additional mentioning of kares by achos ishto, that you can only get kares and you don't get malchus. So according to Rabbi Yitzchak, that's why kares is mentioned specifically by achos ishto. So from where does he get this din of lechalek, that you're liable for each and every erva, even though you do multiple prohibited acts, one after the other? So the Gemara says, Nafgalei mi ve'el isha benidas tum asa lechayev al kol isha ve'isha. And the answer is that he has another pasuk, Rabbi Yitzchak. It says, ve'el isha, do not approach a woman when she is menstruant. Now the word isha is superfluous because the Torah says, Torah could have just said, do not approach a woman do not approach a nida. Why does it have to say, do not approach a woman who is a nida? The answer is to tell me that for each and every individual woman, you're liable a separate penalty. Now, dodaso dekasov barachmana aririm yihiyu lamali. Now, the next topic. We know that, as we're going to see on Amid Beis, the Torah writes the word aririm by 3 of the arayos. Now, what does the word aririm mean? It means destitute. And it's really, in a way, synonymous with the penalty of with the word kares. Because kares means to be cut off, but aririm, it means to be destitute. Destitute of what? Destitute of children. Because we know that from other Gemaras that one of the manifestations of kares is that, God forbid, a person's child or children can die during his lifetime. So therefore, why does the Torah have to write the word aririm explicitly by when a person has an encounter with his uncle's wife? If we know that there's a general penalty of kares for all of the arayos, why does aririm have to be mentioned specifically by dodaso? Lamali l'cheder Rabba. The Rabba Ramik, because Rabba raised the contradiction. Kesiv aririm yihiyu, uchesiv aririm yamusu. He says that there are 2 places where the Torah writes aririm. One is in the context of Eshes Achiv. It says by your brother's wife, if you have an encounter, it says aririm yihiyu. And the other pasuk says by dodaso, it says aririm yamusu. So why does it have to write one aririm yihiyu, they shall be aririm, and the other one says they shall die aririm? So ha-ketzad, yesh lo banim kovran, ein lo banim holech ariri. So the answer is that the 2 psukim are indicative of 2 different things. That number 1, if a person already has children, then the word aririm means that he will, God forbid, bury them. But the other pasuk, which means aririm yamusu, they will die destitute, means that if he doesn't have children at all, and then he commits the offense, he will not be blessed with children in the future and will die childless. So ve'itzrich lemichtav aririm yihiyu, ve'itzrich lemichtav aririm yamusu.
Why not arurim?
What?
Arurim.
No, arurim with an aleph. This is aririm with an ayin, which does not mean cursed, it means destitute, left, bereft, beli shum davar. Okay? So the Gemara says, V'yitzrich l'michtav aririm yamusu. So the Gemara really is following up on this point. And it is telling me that even in a situation where a person has children, you also need to write both of them. Why? Di'i kasav rachmana aririm yihiyu, hava amina ad chatoe, avol mechatoe va'elach lo, kasav rachmana aririm yamusu. V'i kasav rachmana aririm yamusu, hava amina mechatoe va'elach, avol mikar lo tzricha. This is to tell you an additional feature of kares. And that is that if the Torah would have only written aririm yihiyu, then I might have thought that the only children who are up for being punished or being taken away are children that a person has at the time of the commission of the crime. If the Torah would have just said aririm yihiyu, I might have thought that, okay, fine, only children that I have up to that time are subject to the penalty. But any subsequent children that I give birth to are not included. And if the Torah would have just written aririm yamusu, then a person might think that only the children that I have after the sin are subject to the penalty of being taken away, God forbid, but not children that predated the sin. And therefore, even for a person who has children, the Torah has to write both aririm yihiyu and aririm yamusu to tell that person that both the children that you had before the sin and the children that you have after the sin are subject to be taken away because of the sin.
Rabbi, in the last week you were talking about whether we should compare a brother's wife to a sister or to an aunt.
Right.
and we concluded a sister, but here now we see the word Aryai comes in the aunt and the brother's wife. So
correct.
Why does the Gemara say, well, you got this word, there's a hekesh, there's something...
That's a very good question. I don't know why the Gemara doesn't say, well, the two of them connect scripturally because of this word. Usually, there's a general principle that whenever you make a gzeira shava, there has to be a tradition that such a gzeira shava exists. You can't just pull out two words that are the two psukim have in common. There has to be a mesorah that these two words were scripturally linked at Har Sinai. Okay. Ha'ara dechayve lavin minolan. So now the Gemara asks, now we're going back to our sensitive topic, and we'll try to retain our composure today. We're going back to a sensitive topic of what's called ha'ara, which is a partial insertion. And as we'll see, we learned yesterday that partial insertion, according to the Gemara, if you're dealing with a chayve krisus, an encounter for which you get kares, the Torah holds you liable even for a partial insertion. So the question now is, how do you know that that's true also by a lesser offense, such as chayve lavin, where the penalty is only a mitzvah lo saseh, it's not an isser kares? So the Gemara answers, Midigoli rachmona shichva zera gabe shivcha charufa, michlal de chayve lavin baha'ara. So the Gemara says, it's very interesting the way Rashi explains it. There's a case in the Torah called shivcha charufa. Now, what is a shivcha charufa? This is a Canaanite woman slave who has already been betrothed to a Hebrew slave, a Jewish slave. The Torah says that a Jewish slave is allowed to marry a shivcha Canaanis, allowed to marry a Gentile woman slave. Let's say she's already betrothed to him through some kind of contractual marriage, and a Jewish free man goes ahead and has an encounter with this woman. So the halacha is, the Torah says that's an isser lo saseh, that's just aser, right, because the Torah prohibits it. But then the Torah goes on to say that if a man does that act, giving forth shichva zera, giving forth his seed, so the halacha is that that man, assuming that he did it unintentionally, has to bring a korban asham, has to bring a sin offering. Now, the very fact that the Torah only specifies the term shichva zera in the context of the korban teaches me that a non-shichva zera form of intercourse is subsumed under the mitzvahs lo saseh, where the korban is not mentioned. So therefore, we learn from this that anytime there's a mitzvahs lo saseh, even a partial insertion, which does not necessarily fall under the rubric of shichva zera, because you're not completing the act of intercourse, is nevertheless going to be aser, even by an isser lo saseh. So now the Gemara says, Adarabba midagoli rachmana ha'ara b'chayve krisus mechlal dechayve lavin v'gmar bia. But the Gemara says, but I could argue just the opposite. I could argue the very fact that the Torah talks about ha'ara only in the context of an isser kares, like we learned yesterday by nida. It talks about ha'ara. Maybe that we can infer from that anything less than an isser kares has to do a full act of intercourse in order to be liable. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ashi im kein lishto kram shivcha charufa. So the Gemara says, well, if that were the case, as Rav Ashi, then the Torah would not have to talk about full intercourse of shichva zera by a shivcha charufa. I would infer that anyway. The very fact that the Torah writes it explicitly teaches me that the only time that you have to have full intercourse is in order to be liable for a korban. But partial insertion is enough, even for an isser lav, to be liable for the sin. Now, ha'ara dechayve lavin to kahuna minolan. So now the Gemara asks another question. Okay, fine. That fulfills that you know that ha'ara is enough for an isser lo saseh that is common to all Jews. What about an isser lo saseh that is exclusive to a certain segment of Jews like Kohanim? So, for example, how do I know that if a Kohen has an encounter with a divorcee and he only does a partial insertion, that he's liable for the sin? How do you know that? The asya kicha kicha. So the Gemara says, because we have a gzeira shava over here. It says by chayve krisus, by isha sher yikaches achosa, that if a man shall take his sister, using the verb of taking, and it says by the kohanim, lo yikachu, do not marry a divorcee or any other kind of woman that is forbidden to the kahuna, using the same verb. So we therefore learn that any sexual act which is prohibited by an isser kares is the same sexual act that's prohibited by the kohanim.
Rabbi, the sexual act, there's a partial insertion, there's full insertion, and then there's zera. So I mean, they may not all What's the Torah talking about here?
You're right. The implication that the Gemara is trying to get across is that Shechva Zera is synonymous with full insertion. How the Gemara knows this, it's not really that clear to me, but the Gemara is inferring that partial insertion means that you didn't complete the sexual act. You pulled out before ejaculation. Okay. So now the Gemara says the Chai ve'asei. Now, how do you know that anyone who only is prohibited by a mitzvah's aseh, not even a mitzvah's los aseh, but just a positive command? What's an example? The Torah says that you're only allowed to marry an Egyptian convert after the third generation of the converts in the family. So that implies that anyone who's less than that, there's a mitzvah's aseh not to have a sexual encounter with that person. So how do you know that you incur the sin by just doing an act of ha'ara, not a full act of bia? So the Gemara says, asya bia bia. So there too we have a gzeira shava from Chai ve'lavin. By Chai ve'lavin it says, lo yavo mamzer, that a mamzer may not enter. And it also says, by the Egyptian, it says yavo. It says, he shall come in after the third generation. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Yevama l'shuk minolan. How do you know that if a woman is a Yevama, and instead of doing Yibum, she has an encounter with an outside man, that the penalty is after just ha'ara? So, ilaman da'amar lav lav, ilaman da'amar aseh aseh. I don't understand your question, says the Gemara. There's a machlokus whether Yevama l'shuk is an isser lo saseh or an isser aseh. But now that we've demonstrated for both mitzvahs lo saseh and for mitzvahs aseh, the sin is accomplished through ha'ara, well, then why do you have a specific question about a Yevama? So the Gemara answers, Ela Yevama liyava minolan. But rather, you're right. Our question is not how is the sin accomplished, but rather how is the mitzvah of Yibum accomplished? Do you have to have full intercourse, or can you have just a partial insertion to accomplish the mitzvah of Yibum? So the Gemara answers, Asya bia bia. So the answer once again is we have this gzeira shava, because the Torah says Yevamo yavo aleha, that just like the verb ba, coming, is in reference to a mitzvah's lo saseh, which refers to ha'ara, so too is that very same verb used in the context of Yibum. Now, isha labayla minal. So now the next question is, how do I know that if a man wants to be kona and isha, wants to marry a woman through the act of bia, which is one of the permissible ways to marry a woman, how do you know that that is accomplished through ha'ara alone and not full? So asya kicha kicha. Once again, you have a gzeira shava to connect the act of marriage to the act of in a forbidden erva relationship. Both have the verb kicha, and therefore you learn one from the other. Amar Rava, Lamali dekasav Rachmana Shichva Zer b'Shivcha Charufa. Let's go back to the case of Shivcha Charufa. Why did the Torah have to specifically say an act, a sexual act that involves Shichva Zera? So the Gemara answers Shichva Zera be'eshes ish, Shichva Zera b'sota. And why too? The term Shichva Zera is used in three places. It's used in the context of Shivcha Charufa, it's used by Eshes Ish, and it's used in the context of Sota. Why in those three places did the Torah specifically term a sexual act in terms of Shichva Zera, which means an ejaculation? So the Gemara answers, the Shivcha Charufa Kida Amran. So we've already answered why it's written in the context of Shivcha Charufa, to teach you that for a mitzvah's lo saseh, you're going to be liable even for less than a full sexual act. And de eshes ish prat lemishamesh meis. And why is it written in the context of a married woman? To tell you that even though with a married woman, you're going to be liable even for a partial insertion, but it's telling you another halacha. It's telling you that if a man commits a sexual act with a non-erect organ, he's going to be exempt. And that's why the Torah says Shichva Zera. It has to be a sexual act that could bring one to ejaculation. And if a person is not having an erection at the time of insertion, that's not an act that could bring to ejaculation, and therefore you're not liable for the act of adultery. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Hanicha laman da'amar mishamesh meis ba'arayos pater. Laman da'amar chayv ma'ikal amemar. But that's only good if you learn like that opinion that says that if a person does an insertion with a non-erect organ, that's not called an act of a sexual crime. But what if you hold that it is a sexual crime by the Aryai? What are you going to say? Ela prat lemishamesh mesa. What do we call this? Necrophilia, I think we call this, right? What if a man has a sexual encounter with a dead woman who was married at the time of her death? So you might have thought that he's not going to be, he may be just doing something that's abject and disgusting, but the question is, has he committed adultery? Because after all, this woman was married at the time of her death. Or would you say, no, she's not married to the guy anymore because she's dead? So the Gemara says, I might have thought that since the Torah actually mentions that even a deceased wife is she'ero, is still his relative, in other words, in the context of this woman's children, right, as far as the connection between her family and the husband, even after her death, I might have thought that she's still considered a married woman even after she's deceased, and that's why the Torah has to tell me, no, it's only when a man could actually impregnate this woman to the exclusion of when she's already deceased. Therefore, it's not considered an act of adultery anymore if she's already deceased. It's obviously a disgusting act, or it's like criminal, but it's not an act of adultery anymore. So now the question is, Desota Lamali. Why does it write Shechva Zera in the context of Sota, where the Torah says, the pasuk says, "V'shachav ish osa shechva zera," that in the Parshas Nasa, when it talks about the laws of Sota, it says that in the event that a man lay with her and gave forth his seed. So why does it have to write gave forth his seed? L'chidetanya shechva zera prat ledavar acher. This is to the exclusion of some other kind of act which was not a sexual act. So the Gemara says, "My davar acher." What does that mean? So Amar Rav Sheshes prat l'shekine la shelo kedarka. This is to the exclusion of a case where a man suspects his wife of having an affair, where the man is not having intercourse with her in the normative way through frontal entry, but he's having intercourse through anal entry. And therefore, it's to say that that's not a case of sota. That woman is not subject to the protocol of a sota. So the Gemara says, Amarle Rava, Mishkavei Ishaksiv. How can you say that? We've learned before, based on the fact that the Torah uses the term Mishkavei, intercourse in the plural, teaches me that any form of intercourse, whether it's frontal or anal entry, is considered to be a sexual act. So you can't tell me that it's the exclusion to that. So Ella Amar Rava, Prat L'Shekine La Derech Evarim. The answer is that he suspects his wife of having an affair, but not through intercourse at all, but rather through the gratification of the male through other means other than his insertion into her body in the normative way. And I'll just say, in a Clinton-esque fashion, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Amar le Abaya Pritzusa Asa Rachmana, question mark. So the Gemara says, you mean to tell me that I need a pasuk to tell me that if a woman commits a licentious act that is not sexual, you need to tell me that she's excluded from being a sota? Isn't that already obvious? Why would I think that the Torah would call that a sota? So it's very interesting, because in today's society, that is considered adultery. But from the Gemara standpoint, it's obvious that that's not an act of adultery, because there was no entry of the male into the female, so right?
Nothing would happen to her when she drank the sota.
Right. If she drank this, the whole protocol would not apply to her. We wouldn't even allow her. If the husband said, "I suspect that my wife is doing something oral with a man," we wouldn't even allow her to come to the Beis Hamikdash for that. So the Gemara says, why do I even need a pasuk of Shechva Zera to demonstrate that that's excluded? So Ela Amar Abaye Prat L'Shekine La B'Neshika. So the answer is that we are not suspicious of this licentious act that's not sex, but we are suspicious that the husband is suspecting his wife of having an affair where her adulterer is not doing an insertion at all, where all he's doing is that they're coming in physical contact, but there's no penetration whatsoever. But the two sexual organs are coming into physical contact with each other. That's what's called nishika. There's physical contact between the sex organs, but there's no penetration.
So Clinton must have learned this Gemara.
So anyway, so the Gemara says, "Don't, Bob. We have to keep a straight face throughout the Gemara today." So the Gemara now says, "Hanich laman da'amar ha'ara zu hachnasus atorah, el laman da'amar zu nishika ma'ika lameimar." The Gemara says, but wait a minute, you're going to see a machlokus in just a few lines as to what exactly the definition of ha'ara'a is. Remember, we learned that ha'ara'a, by any of the arayos, is considered to be the accomplishment of the sin. There's one opinion that says that the very definition of ha'ara is not partial insertion, but rather just a physical contact between the male organ and the female organ. So how can you tell me that that's excluded if that's by definition a sexual act according to one Manda Amar? So the Gemara says, Ela la'olam l'shekine la derech evarim ve'itzterich salkadaita chamina b'kepeda debal tala rachmana b'haka kapid kamash malan. So the Gemara says, you're right. We're going to go back to our original answer, which is that that I might have thought that a woman could be brought to the temple as a sota, even if the suspicion is that she's committing oral sexual crimes, which don't involve actual sexual acts. Why? Because even if she's like, Clinton-esque in this fashion, I might have thought that the Torah would allow her to be brought to the Beis HaMikdash as a sota. You know why? Because since the Torah bases it on the husband's jealousy, any husband would be jealous of a wife doing this, and therefore maybe she would be included in the laws of sota. Comes along the Torah that says, no, since it's not mamish a sexual act, therefore she's excluded.
So Clinton used this.
That's what Bob just said. Clinton used this Gemara. Okay. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel now says, all right. Okay. Well, okay. We won't shout it too loud now. Ha'ara azu neshika. So now Shmuel now says, Ha'ara azu neshika. Now here's where we're going to see our machlokus between the Amoraim as to what the definition of ha'ara is. Shmuel says the definition of ha'ara is what we call this neshika, which is just physical contact, even without any penetration whatsoever. And the reason why he says is that if metaphorically we could say that just like if a person takes his finger and puts it on his lips, there's not going to be even. You can't say there's not going to be even a slight depression. There's going to be a slight depression on the lips. So too, anytime there's physical contact, there's a slight partial depression, and that's enough to accomplish a sexual act. So ki asa Rabba bar bar Chana amar Rabbi Yechanan gemar bia b'shivcha charufa zu hachnasa satara. Now Rabba bar bar Chana quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying that when the Torah says that you have to do a complete sexual act by shivcha charuf in order to bring a korban, what does a complete sexual act mean? It means just the penetration of the glands of the organ and not a full penetration. Now, which seems to be surprising because we had learned before that ha'ara means the penetration of just the head of the organ, right? And now we're saying that no, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's a full sexual act. So we'll explain this in just a minute. So Masiv Rav Sheshes, so Rav Sheshes now challenges this. Shichva zera eno chayev ela al bias hamiruk. That the Brisa says that when the Torah uses the term shichva zera, it only makes you liable when you have an intercourse which is miruk, which is a full consummation. Limarek is to completely exhaust something, right? I don't know, how do they translate the word miruk in the English? But ejaculation, right? A complete exhaustion of the testes, right? So now the question is, my lav miruk yid, doesn't it mean a full insertion, right? Isn't that what's implied also, that you have to completely insert? So the Gemara says, no, lo miruk atara. No, it means that you can have a partial insertion and ejaculate through only a partial insertion. That's enough to be called shichva zera. Now, ki asa Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan, but now another student of Rabbi Yochanan came along and said just the opposite, that ha'ara zu achnasa satara, that the the word ha'ara means the insertion of the glands, which would imply that shichva, when the Torah uses the term shichva zera, it doesn't mean ha'ara, or the achnasa satara, but it means a full insertion. So amru leiva harabba bar bar Chana lo amar hachi. So they said to him, Rav Dimi, you're quoting Rabbi Yochanan one way, and Rabbi Bar Chana quoted Rabbi Yochanan the opposite way. And he said that no, the shichva zera insertion is the insertion of the glands, which implies that ha'ara is something less than that. So Amar Lahu, o ihu shakroi, o ana shakri. So Rav Dimi said, well, listen, either he's lying or I'm lying. You're right. One of us is not quoting Rabbi Yochanan correctly. Now, ki asa Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan ha'ara zu hachnasa satara. So Rabin comes along and he says the same thing as Rav Dimi, and he says that the insertion of the glands is what we call ha'ara, which is a partial sexual act.
Is that just a touching, or is that the...
No. That's the difference. There's 3 stages here. Yeah. Neshika is touching. Ha'ara is partial insertion. And we said that there's something called full insertion. And there's a machlokes whether you need full insertion to be called shechva zera. So now the Gemara says, Adarabba bar barchana vaday polig. Adishmul milema polig. So we know that clearly Rabin is arguing on Rabbi bar Barchana, because Rabbi bar Barchana said that according to Rabbi Yochanan, a full sexual act is considered just the insertion of the glands, which means that can't be the same thing as ha'ara. So certainly he's arguing with Rabbi bar Barchana, but is he arguing with Shmuel as well? Now, what did Shmuel say? Shmuel had said that ha'ara is accomplished by just neshika, by just physical contact. So it sounds like he's arguing with him because he says that ha'ara is accomplished seemingly only by a partial insertion of the glands. So the Gemara says, lo. Minashika v'adachnasus atara ha'ara karila. So perhaps not. The Gemara says, really it could be that this quote from Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel are not in disagreement. Shmuel is telling you what is the beginning of the act of ha'ara, which is physical contact, and Rabbi bar Barchan is telling you the other end of ha'ara. In other words, the other limit of ha'ara. So it could be that they're really not arguing. Shmuel's telling you how ha'ara begins, and Rabbi bar Barchana tells you where ha'ara ends, right? But really, it could be they're not arguing with each other. The range, exactly. Very good. Ki aser of Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar Rabbi Yochanan ha'ara azu hachnasas atara, and Gemar Bia mamish. And Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, is much more explicit, and he says that the term ha'ara refers to the insertion of the glands, and when the Torah says shechva zera to imply a full intercourse, it means mamash, a full insertion of the organ. Mikan ve'elach ena ela neshika. But anything less than a insertion of the glands is meaningless. There's no sexual act being committed at all. That's upater aleha, and therefore you're pater for it. And here, this statement clearly upalagat Shmuel. This statement clearly argues with Shmuel because it's explicitly saying that neshika is not a sexual act. Oh boy. Okay. Have a wonderful